Okay, good evening, everyone. As we get started this evening, I would like to remind us that we are gathered in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources. In fact, they recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title, established the rules for what was meant to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We strive for right relations and respectful partnerships with all Indigenous peoples as we work toward collective healing and true reconciliation, while honoring this beautiful land together. I invite all who are joining us virtually in chat to acknowledge the lands from which you are joining us this evening. I would also like to recognize that Nova Scotia is home to 52 Nova Scotian communities, African Nova Scotian communities, whose culture, heritage, and histories have been and remain a key part of this province for more than 400 years. For generations, African Nova Scotians have experienced inequities due to systemic racism in Nova Scotia, which they continue to face today. We strive to listen to and learn from the first voice perspectives of Black Nova Scotians, amplify Black voices, support Black communities, and address inequities and injustices in our work together. My name is Pauline McIntosh, and on behalf of StFX's Coady Institute, formerly the StFX Extension Department and the Coady International Institute, I am very pleased to welcome you here this evening for what I know is going to be an interesting and insightful presentation. We are gathered this evening recognizing that the United Nations General Assembly has declared 2025 as the International Year of Cooperatives, and that on March 8th, we will celebrate International Women's Day, for which the Government of Canada has declared the 2025 theme, Strength in Every Story, to share stories of women in the Antigonish Movement for present and future community action. Without further ado, I invite Robin Neustaeter, an assistant professor in the StFX Department of Adult Education, and Sophie Gallant, a student in StFX's Public Policy and Governance program, to tell us about their research and to share stories of three women of the Antigonish movement. Robin and Sophie, welcome.
Great. Thank you, Pauline. Just going to quickly highlight, in going through the archives in regards to finding pictures of women in the Antigonish and Cooperative Movements, thanks to Devin Fraser in the archives here, we were delighted to find this picture that is on the first slide, because it's an anomaly amongst the pictures to see the front table of a cooperative congress featuring only and all women. Most of them are mostly men, with perhaps one woman, and that one woman may be holding a pen and is the secretary. So it's a celebration and delight to see this presence of women at such an event. So the title of this presentation is an adaptation of a quote from Sister Irene Doyle, a sister of St. Martha, who began working with the StFX Extension Department in 1935 after graduating from Mount St. Bernard College. So the women's college that was associated with St. Francis Xavier University at the time, so she graduated in 35. And it was informed by her firsthand experience as a field worker. And she said later on, reminiscing, women really were the backbone of the movement. And she said that in an interview with CBC in 1996. And others, including Ida Gallant Delaney, who also worked with Sister Irene Doyle, recognized women as key support and connectors as the backbone of the movement. So that's inspired our presentation this evening. So just an overview of our presentation. So we'll start by introducing, the whole presentation will introduce women of the Antigonish movement, also give a bit of context and story of a very brief overview of the movement if it's something that's new to you, and a little introduction to the research project that I've been working on with Sophie. And then Sophie's going to share stories of 3 of the women that she met while doing the research. And then we're going to call Pauline up to talk about one of her experiences as an extension field worker, working with women in the movement. And then we'll wrap up with some of our own reflections and thoughts on the relevance of this work today. And then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. So as noted earlier, this presentation builds on a research project called What Can the Women Do? Women and the Antigonish Movement. And the title of the project comes from this pamphlet written by Sister Irene Doyle called What Can the Women Do? And it's a historical feminist case study that started in 2023 to explore women's work in the Antigonish and Cooperative Movements in northeastern Nova Scotia, including Cape Breton, using archives, literature, and interviews. And the study centers women's experiences and voices in the movement, starting from the beginning of the movement prior to the establishment of the StFX Extension Department, and slowly working its way forward in time. And as I said about the title of the slide. So the Antigonish movement began to address the complicated socioeconomic challenges, in particular the systemic poverty experienced by people in the fishing, farming, and mining regions of northeastern Nova Scotia, and it used popular adult education and economic development, particularly through cooperatives. At the turn of the century, life was very different in these areas than we see it today. Fishers and farmers were selling their catch and harvest to buyers or merchants who went on to sell these at a higher rate. In order to do their work, they had to purchase their supplies for their work, but also, household goods on credit from the stores. And when their debts at the store their debts at the store, so purchases they made, were deducted from their paychecks. And when it came to time for them to get their money, they had little to show for their hard work. In the mining communities, particularly in industrial Cape Breton, it was a very kind of similar setup in regards to the miners and their families often lived in houses owned by the mining company with electricity from the mining company. They shopped at the company store on credit. You could only buy beans on credit. You couldn't buy meat on credit. And on Saturdays, when the miners would go to get their checks every second Saturday, there were deductions for rent, store purchases, electricity, medical bills, would come off their paycheck. And sometimes they would have very little or they would owe money. And so within these circumstances, and this is just a very brief kind of picture, there's, encourage you to kind of look into more if you're curious about it. They really tried to make a living. And it was very difficult, as you can imagine, under these circumstances to kind of get ahead or have a good life. But they did the best that they could. At the same time, notably, these people had a very strong sense of community care, fellowship, and self-help, particularly through churches, volunteer associations, and in the industrial areas, unions. And it is these assets that the Antigonish movement used to build its success. And then in 1928, the St. Francis Xavier University founded the Extension Department after years of advocacy and non-formal community education programs here on campus through people schools and conferences and short courses and community study clubs. To organize the Extension Department's purpose was to organize and support people in communities, particularly starting in the Diocese of Antigonish, to move forward a program of social change. And here we have a picture of the Program of Social Change banner painted by Sister Irene Doyle that captures the ethos of the movement. In particular, the central role of the people in communities to use education and action, for example, in labor unions, consumer, producer, and housing cooperatives, credit unions, and culture to advance their economic and political democratic change. And they did this using various methods of adult education, including study clubs, short courses, conferences, mass meetings, people schools, as well as theater, radio, television, and film. People gathered to critically analyze the circumstances of their lives and explore ways to advocate and build opportunities to improve their lives and well-being as individuals, families, and communities. And you can, I'm going to put a little plug in here, but you can see the original program for social change banner in the McDonald Library. So that's a bit of an overview of the Antigonish movement. And you may have noticed that I didn't say much about the women, but I'm going to leave that up to Sophie. So Sophie, off to you. No pressure.
So the first woman I want to highlight for you all today is Sister Marie Michael McKinnon. Today, we're surrounded by her legacy of kindness and hospitality as we gather in this library, which was renamed in her honor. I like to think that we're honoring her belief that libraries are meant to be a place of learning and discussion for all, rather than a stuffy, exclusive kind of place as we gather here and engage in these important conversations. So Sister Marie Michael is originally from Boysdale in Cape Breton and was an active member of Father Gillis's parish. It was here that she first recognized the importance of cooperatives in agriculture. At 18, she went to Truro for a 6-week course to get her teaching license, and from there she went on to teach at rural schools for 3 years. In 1927, she joined the Sisters of St. Martha and was quickly sent to MacDonald College in Quebec to study household sciences. After going back to teaching in St. Andrews, she went to StFX in 1931 to pursue a Bachelor of Arts. She excelled in her studies and received a Governor General's Medal for the head work. After her graduation in 1933, she joined the StFX Extension department. At first, she noted that she felt underprepared by her education for this big job ahead of her, but she dove right into the heavy workload. She was immediately appointed the director of their brand new Women in Work program and was given the task of promoting women's leadership and participation in the Antigonish movement. Through this program, she also gathered study materials for making pamphlets for the women's study clubs. Sister Marie Michael and Sister Irene Doyle worked together to produce and share tons of information about nutrition, home management, buying, handicrafts, and any other relevant aspect of homemaking. This program helped them to identify skilled women in the communities and helped them to lead in sharing their knowledge with others. Despite all of the effort put into this program and the high regard for the importance of women being engaged with the movement, the funding they received was minimal at best. Sister Marie Michael shared that she felt their program survived on scraps of leftover money. With all the changes brought onto women's work during the Second World War, the Women in Work program was eventually terminated in 1944. In addition to this work, Sister Marie Michael was also the author of the women's pages in the Extension Bulletin. This writing, along with much of her work, was all part of her constant effort to help women. She advocated for more funding for the Women in Work program and gave speeches supporting the importance of working with women in the cooperative movement. She gave one speech in 1942 at a staff conference called "The Woman Speaks Her Mind." According to her and several of her colleagues, this speech was particularly lively, and apparently the printed version that exists is much milder than what was actually said. Sister Marie Michael's commitment to empowering women stems from her vocation to serve others. As a Sister of St. Martha, she was known for her hospitality, often welcoming visitors to the Antigonish movement and guiding them through campus. This same spirit of openness shaped the library services that she organized. In the 40s, she dedicated more time to the Extension Library, recognizing its vital role in adult education. Aware of the instability of women's program funding, she strengthened her expertise as both an adult educator and a professional librarian.
After studying in Boston in the 1950s, she returned briefly to the Extension Library before joining the brand new Coady International Institute Library in 1960. On top of her work as a librarian, Sister Marie Michael hosted a weekly radio show on CJFX that was similar to her Between the Leaves column in the Maritime Cooperator. She shared her love of books, reviewed selections from the cooperative education, and would find different texts that she believed to be engaging and important for the listeners, and occasionally invited students to join her on air. Listeners frequently wrote to request books, and some, like one man who had learned to read at 65, credited her program with transforming their lives. Sister Marie Michael's genuine interest in people and ability to connect with them were her greatest assets. Using these skills, she worked tirelessly to serve others to achieve a full and abundant life for everyone. Her contributions to women's involvement in the movement were significant, and her legacy lives on at StFX today. Now, next, I'd like to tell you about Zita O'Hearn Cameron, a talented writer and Extension employee. She was originally from Melrose, New Brunswick, and attended boarding school at a convent near Moncton. Her father recommended that she pursue higher education, leading her to Antigonish to study at Mount St. Bernard College in StFX, where she received her Bachelor of Arts in 1934. Working as a teacher, one of her colleagues suggested that she should pursue a master's degree, which she did in 1937. During her studies, she would also teach at the high school run by the nuns to make a living during the hard years of the 1930s. She excelled at StFX and earned high praises for her writing. In the very first year that women were allowed to contribute, she was recruited to write for the Xaverian Weekly, the campus newspaper. Her article on Humpty Dumpty impressed Bishop Morrison so much that he mentioned it at her master's graduation. The rector, who was attending the ceremony, took note, read the piece, and immediately saw her as the ideal assistant in writing Dr. Moses Cody's book. In the summer after her graduation, she was attending the Rural and Industrial Conference at StFX when Dr. Coady pulled over right next to her and called her out by name as she was walking. He offered her the job at Extension from the window of his car. Now, she didn't know him, and she didn't really know what the job would be, but she accepted the position anyways because opportunities like these were few and far between during the Great Depression. Once she started working, the writing process was a bit slow. Rather than sticking to a set plan, Dr. Coady would speak at length about the topics he knew he wanted to include, while Zita copied everything he said. At the end of the day, he'd assemble a group and display his favorite phrases from the day. And so this writing process was taking a lot longer than expected, so the Rockefellers, who had sponsored the book, suggested that they take a trip to Beaufort, South Carolina, in order to get some more writing done. According to Zita, the trip didn't speed up the process, but it did lead to plenty of delicious meals during their travels. As several people have mentioned, her contributions to the book Masters of Their Own Destiny were substantial, and some could consider her to have been his ghostwriter. Once the book was completed, she stayed on at Extension as Dr. Coady's personal secretary. As was often the case, her work went beyond the typical secretarial duties. If something needed to be done, she would see to it. She wrote pamphlets and was critical of the fact that pamphlet writing was considered women's work. Zita felt that all work should be anyone's work and found this separate classification of women's work to be demeaning. She wrote editorials for The Casket, our local newspaper, and contributed poetry to the Extension Bulletin. Each year, she compiled and published the annual Extension reports in the Halifax Herald, Halifax Chronicle, and Sydney Post. When the bulletins were replaced by the Maritime Cooperator, she took over the women's page from Sister Marie Michael. Over the years, she got tired of the women's pages. Like I said, she believed that specific women's work shouldn't be separated and that the women's pages shouldn't be there at all, especially since they mostly just covered general cooperation in the later years. Reflecting on her feelings, she said, always felt, even in those days, and it became stronger as the years went on, that there shouldn't be a discrimination of women's roles, women's contributions, that we were all people, we were all cooperators, and that there shouldn't be too much of a distinction. So in 1970, Kay Desjardins retired from her role as editor of the Maritime Cooperator. Now, although it wasn't part of Zita's plans, she stepped up and took over as editor until 1977. This followed a pattern in her life that she remarked upon of being personally sought out for every job that she ever had. Apparently, any job she applied for, she wouldn't get. Beyond writing, she hosted a World War II radio show airing 3 times a week. Due to wartime security concerns, she was strictly prohibited from mentioning the weather, fearing that German forces might use it to target Antigonish. So her contributions earned widespread recognition, including awards from the Canadian Women's Press Club and Cooperative Editorial Association. In 1978, she received an honorary doctorate from StFX during the Extension Department's 50th anniversary celebrations. Her impressive work and brilliant writing are deserving of applause and make her one of the many memorable and influential women of the StFX Extension Department. All right, so the final profile I'll be presenting today is Mary Laban, one of the founding members of the Tompkinsville Housing Cooperative. This community, built in 1938 by miners and their wives, was the first of its kind in Canada. The Labans moved into their house ahead of the other Tompkinsville residents in order to connect electric power to their housing development. So, because of this, Mary served the very first hot meal in Tompkinsville and worked with the other women to feed everyone that was working on the houses. The women of Tompkinsville also organized cooperatively for themselves, frequently pooling their skills and their resources to make quilts and clothing, as well as putting together $1.50 to go into Sydney together and watch Gone with the Wind in the movie theater. Mary Laban was one of the many women who built connection and community between the families of this cooperative group by making the most of what they had. They celebrated their first Christmas in Tompkinsville with some treats for the children and songs of celebration, even though the floors hadn't even put down in the houses yet. Mary played a key role in transforming this cooperative housing development into a close-knit community. She and the other women worked together to create a welcoming environment and a strong support network, pooling resources to help one another. Mary Laban is a great example of the impact of women's involvement in the Antigonish movement as community members. From the earliest developments of the Tompkinsville Housing Cooperative, she demonstrated leadership by hosting study clubs in their company house and participating in both women's and general study clubs. Her home also hosted their credit union before it was moved into its own building. She had a formal education up until the 12th grade and used her knowledge to uplift others, teaching her husband writing and arithmetic since he was a minor who didn't have the opportunity to complete as much formal education. Thanks to her, he would continue to learn independently from the library and was able to study cooperation. Her commitment to the cooperative movement was remarkable, and she continued to demonstrate her support by hosting students from the Coady Institute to visit Tompkinsville and hear the stories of the pioneering this cooperative housing development. Her eagerness to share her stories in promotion of Tompkinsville and the Antigonish movement are a testament to her commitment to cooperation and community.
Now we're going to invite Pauline up to share one of her stories. Thank you. Yeah. So I don't have a formal talk prepared for this part of the program, but I will share with you that I was hired as a full-time field worker with the StFX Extension Department on August 31st of 1998. And as I reported for duty the first Tuesday after Labor Day, I entered the office and was talking with my new colleagues. And within a couple of days, a couple of weeks, I was noticing there was a lot of activity happening in Guysborough County. And at that time, one of my colleagues was a gentleman named John Carney. And John was a fisheries expert who came in to work with the Extension Department to reintroduce, I will say, the idea of community-based fisheries management in local communities around not just Nova Scotia, but throughout the Maritimes. So John had a very long and extensive background in anthropology as well as ecology, had his PhD in that area. And with the support of the Sisters of St. Martha, he and another colleague, Nancy O'Regan, started holding kitchen meetings in Guysborough County. And this was as a result of what Nancy had been hearing on the ground as a field worker, that the women in Guysborough County wanted to do something to support their husbands, their partners, their community related to inshore fisheries, which was one of the main areas of the economy for that location. So again, with the support of the Sisters of St. Martha, John and Nancy set about hosting kitchen meetings in 8 communities in Guysborough County. However, they didn't work alone. They hired a woman from each of those communities to co-facilitate these kitchen meetings with them. And these meetings brought up a lot of interest from the women about what they would like to do to enhance their communities. And in large part, the women said they wanted to do something to enhance the fisheries, because the fisheries were such a key economic part of those communities at that time and continue to be today. So, after these initial 8 kitchen meetings were held, a group of women came together. I think there were about 15 who came on a regular basis, and they formed what was called the Guysborough County Women's Fishery Enhancement Association. The women came together, they met, they engaged in some research. They wanted to know, what is government's role in fishery? They wanted to know, what can we do to enhance the fishery? The fishery in that area wasn't considered to be as lucrative as it is in other parts of the province. It has improved since then, but particularly in those days, the late 90s, the early 2000s, it wasn't nearly as strong as it is today. And the women said, well, the first thing we need to do is to start getting information out to people. So Nancy, with a very strong background in the newspaper world and in adult education, said, well, I can support you to create a local newsletter. And these are the pictures that you see on the slide in front of you, called the Fishing News. The women got together, they learned the actual skills for publishing a newsletter, the actual software for the program. They did research on topics that were of interest to them through help from the Extension Department. We were also able to secure an aquatics resource student to work with them and provide support and to begin to impart to them some more formal research skills, although they clearly knew how to get information they really wanted on their own, not to be understated at all. And they decided to start sharing this information with all of the families up and down the shore for whom it would be relevant. This led to some other work, and I don't want to tell their story myself because I have their words in front of me, because I had the pleasure working with another field worker, another woman of the Antigonish Movement named Peggy Mahai, to go in and work with the women to help them document their story once the organization ceased to exist. So I'm going to tell you I'll share a few quotes with you from here and there. So one of the women stated, we started our women's group with the support of the Extension Department and the Sisters of St. Martha by participating in kitchen meetings. The reason for the kitchen meetings was to find out our needs, our goals, and other opportunities we may want to venture into, inside or outside the fishery. The majority of us wanted to enhance the fishing industry. First, we started by studying the government, which was very, very interesting. How the government worked years ago and how they work now related to the fishery. We also learned a lot about community-based management. And from there, they mention forming the group. We were the wives of fishermen, and some of us fished. We wanted to help our husbands and get information about licensing, because you have to get the particulars to apply. Women fill out the licenses, and new things are coming out. We educated one another, and what one didn't know, the other knew. So they found that there were lots of ways in which they could support the economy of their local community, in large part because of the work related to fisheries. Again, in the Fishing News, one person said, eventually we needed a project, and we decided we would start writing a newsletter And the purpose of the newsletter was to inform the fishy families about issues that concern them. Our first issue ran in September 1998. Hence, all the activity in the office when I first joined the Extension department. I recall there being a lot of flurry of activity back in those days, actually doing the photocopying in-house and getting the newsletter bundled to go out to the communities. But the work of these women did not stop there. They really wanted to get more involved in the fishery side of things. Now, scallops naturally occur in the waters off Guysborough County, but it wasn't an industry that was thriving. And the women began to hear that there were instances of people getting together to enhance the naturally existing scallop beds. And they came to John and Nancy here at Extension and said, we really need to learn more about this. And this is what they said. Then it was brought to our attention about a form of enhancing the scallop beds. The scallop fishery had been in decline through the last few years, and scallop enhancement was, hopefully, a way to revive it. So we obtained information, and we had workshops for the scallop license holders. We financed, with the Guysborough County Inshore Fishermen's Association, a field trip to New Brunswick, where they have been doing scallop enhancement over the last 5 years. So these women weren't just sitting around and talking about things. They were mobilizing the fishermen in their communities. They were engaging in educational exchange opportunities. They were bringing new information to the communities where they lived. That was a really nice part of the work that these women did, but they didn't stop there. There was talk of at this time of an organization moving into the Guysborough County waters to start an aquaculture project. And aquaculture was somewhat a divisive topic in those days. There was a lot of concern about how it would impact the already existing species of fish that were being harvested in that area, and a multitude of concerns related to that, while also holding the promise of significant employment, which these communities also desperately needed. And they said, while we were working on scallop enhancement, there was another type of aquaculture in the works proposed for Ann Harbour and the surrounding area, our next door community. It was a proposed finfish farm, which, after being looked into, was going to take up a huge amount of water and was going to displace some lobster fishing efforts and possibly some scallop fishing. We had environmental concerns. We had concerns about pesticides, antibiotics, and if the fish did get diseased, how were they going to treat them? And the notion of this finfish project moving into these waters caused a great deal of community concern, and it was very divisive. The women of the Guysborough County Women's Fishery Enhancement Association decided not to lead the charge, but for some of their members as individuals to join another organization that formed to try to sort out this issue. And they did that because they were afraid there would be repercussions for the organization, and it might deter other women from joining in the future. And there were. A lot of these women did have to deal with negativity in their community, as did others, because it was felt they were confronting a potential opportunity for employment. And the aquaculture project did not go ahead, and in fact, the company suffered financial hardship and turned out not to be successful in the long run. So at the end of the day, it was felt that it was a good thing that it did not develop, but there certainly were implications at the community level. And still, the women did not stop there. In December of 1998, we facilitated a meeting between inshore and offshore fishermen trying to promote community-based management. And as I'm sure many of you know, there are often significant differences in motivation, shall we say, between inshore and offshore fishing, differences in approaches to the fishery, differences in the way fish are harvested. But the women brought these two groups together, and all reports suggested that it was a very, very positive interaction. The women facilitated table discussions between these two groups, and ultimately, they remarked that they had far more in common than they had different at the end of the workshop. So it too proved to be a very good experience. Finally, I'll share with you just a little bit about what these women said in terms of what being part of this association meant to them and meant for them at the end of the day. They talked about building their own individual capacity. There were opportunities and exposure. Now we know what we don't know. A lot of individual growth and development occurred. People became empowered and blossomed. Overall, it was a very positive experience and fun. Friendships developed that will continue for a long time to come. So the women felt that they built their skills, they built their knowledge, they built their expertise, they built their own individual capacity. And as a group, the group achieved a lot in a short time. It shows the difficulties under which women work and what they can achieve. How much more could they achieve under favorable conditions? And I'm sure many of us ask that question at the community level many times as we go about doing our work together. They also talked about how their work built the capacity of the community. The Scallop Enhancement Initiative brought fishermen together to discuss a new idea. Generally, the Women's Association got people talking to each other about fisheries issues. And when asked what were some of the lessons learned, and there are many pages in the story that share those lessons learned, but what one of the women said was, a good discussion starts with women. Women's history is essentially buried. This could change if this story is documented. This story could help others build on what was learned through our experience. Now, the work of the Guysborough County Women's Fishery Enhancement Association spanned the years 1998 to 2001. And they didn't continue beyond that point, but the impact of their work, I believe, was felt for many years to come in those communities. And finally, it was described, their initiative was described as, they started out as a group of women who, because of their interest and role, wanted to learn more about the fishery and alternative fisheries management strategies. Through education, participatory research, and collective action, these women discovered that by working together, they could make a difference. With courage and enthusiasm, they became active participants and leaders in community events and projects. Committed to enhancing the local fisheries and intent on increasing the profile and recognition of women in the fishery and the quality of life for fishing families in their communities. And I, with Peggy Mahan, a former field worker, had the great privilege of working with these women to document their story after their organization had ended. And they today remain just a shining example for me in my work about what women can do in their communities to enhance life for all. And that is a very short encapsulation of the work of the Guysborough County Women's Fishery Enhancement Association. And I will turn it back to Robin and Sophie for a moment. Shared.
Thank you, Pauline. That's what I really always appreciate hearing that story when it comes up. And particularly because it's local and we don't always think about these amazing women and their stories being so close to home. We're often looking for those stories of amazing and inspiring women who are far away or on the big screen or have the best-selling books. But there's so much here. And that's really what this research is highlighting. And so just to share some reflections that have come for us in kind of working and on this research and attending to and looking for and listening to women's stories, the stories of women in the Antigonish movement. And it really kind of highlights how history is hidden in plain sight. And so for me, one of the things that stands out as a reflection on the women in the Antigonish movement is the significance of learning for change. And this is something that I'm passionate about all the time. And considering what's going on in the world now, seems very relevant. But then again, it's always relevant. But the women, as we've been finding in this work, always brought their knowledge, skills, and energy into the various roles that they held in the movement. And what women brought to the movement was often minimalized or dismissed. So their knowledge and expertise as homemakers, organizers, neighbours, community care workers was often not considered important, although their work in those roles was seen as important to the cooperative movement. So there's this kind of disconnect there. And throughout their work and time with working in the movement, they continued to learn. They never stopped learning and to apply their knowledge and develop skills to support the movement to change their lives and their world. And looking at this learning, it was individual, it was collective, it was intentional, it was unintentional. Their learning was practical, theoretical, and critical. And their learning happened in their kitchens, in their communities, on campuses, and in this province. And it made them significant to the movement. And now we benefit from their learning, knowledge, and hard work. And this act of learning for change, this learning in social movements, translates to many movements here and all around the world. And now I'm going to invite Sophie to share her reflections.
So something that's come up for me a lot throughout this research has been the importance of representation of women in leadership. So as a young woman planning on going to work in the public sector in the future, it can be disheartening at times to see like the behaviors and the rhetoric and everything that's being accepted today, and the lack of role models as well for young women like myself to see themselves reflected in these leadership positions, the people that we consider change makers. But although there's not many big names necessarily that we see today, like we've never had an elected woman as prime minister or as premier here in Nova Scotia, but digging deeper into these local stories of women and their work in this movement and in community change has become a source of great inspiration for me. And I hope that learning these stories will also have a similar effect on others who can hear the tales of these women and all the work that they did, and the fact that they put themselves out there despite the adversity. It was not normal for women to be working in these formal paid positions, some of them even after being married, when at these times, say, if you were a teacher, you would lose your job upon getting married if you were a woman. It was very difficult for women to seek out these kinds of paid employments and to find opportunities to create this lasting community change and to be leaders in this more formal capacity that is often more reserved for men. So it's been great for me getting to uncover these stories and see that
even though it might not be the big names on the big screens all the time, the history is there. It's not, I wouldn't be the first one going into this. Other women working in this are not the first to do this. We just don't hear about it much. So I think it's so important to continue uncovering these stories and to show that there is representation for women in leadership and in community change making. Their activism was political. It was everything. It was just, there's so much value in everything that was done. And there's even more value in letting people know that it was done. So that's kind of my reflections for past, present, and future. Past, they were there. Present, we need to remember that and we need to persevere. And future, keep on persevering. That's about it.
Thank you, Sophie and Robin. And for me, my reflections about what informs, my community work personally today and well into the future, and perhaps because I'm a little bit older than you, Sophie, but I have had the incredible pleasure of working with and learning from many of the women of the Antigonish movement, people like Sister Michelle McDougall, who came before me, people like Nancy O'Regan, with whom I still work today, people like Janice Landry, people like Amy Carroll, who's a tremendous adult educator who I learned with and from through the StFX Extension department. And I also see people in the room like Colleen Cameron, the daughter of the great Zita Cameron. And now I know where Colleen gets it. I absolutely know where Colleen gets it. And others, so too many to name. Sally Vanderweel, who's just done such amazing work in the credit union movement, which stemmed from the work of the StFX Extension department in its development of cooperatives and credit unions throughout the Maritimes. And I can't help but think about the housing work. And it gives me such incredible pride to say that Mary Arnold led the development of the very first cooperative housing in Nova Scotia as part of her work at that time with the StFX Extension department. And that is work that Extension resumed doing in 2018 and has been brought into the combined Extension and Cody organization, which is now Cody Institute. It's work that Colleen and I continue to do locally in our community, and I can assure you it is work that we are going to have to continue doing for many years to come because of the housing crisis that we now face, not just in Nova Scotia, not just in Canada, but it's considerably wider than that. So I see the education, the participatory research, the figuring out how government works and figuring out how to work with them, figuring out how do we get sustainable funding to support this work that we're doing at the community level. How can all of that happen? How do we mobilize others in our community to support these initiatives? There are such similarities with the stories that we've heard here tonight and how these women did it and how their passion fueled them and continues to fuel similar movements that we know exist and are thriving at this time and unfortunately are still so very necessary. That is the part that we all have to grapple with. And I think the next step is, while it's something we're always working on, is how do we create the systemic change that we need to see happen so that there isn't a housing crisis any longer, so that there aren't people dealing with mental health and addictions issues without the proper support, so that everyone has access to the kind of education that's needed for people to live well and thrive in our communities. So tremendous overlap, tremendous inspiration from those who came before us, and tremendous lessons for what we do next on our own journey as women in development, as people in development. Thank you so much. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you. And I will slip back into the moderator and ask